Peace. I know you have questions like, is that a cotton plant? Who still wears their hat like this? And no, I promise you, I'm not Mal from the Joe Budden podcast, but shout out to him. It's the other Mal, Malik 16, founder and creator of Plates and Crates, and I'm here to announce our new venture, aptly titled A RAP CRITIC. This is how we're launching it off. And I know you might ask, Malik, why would y'all create a series titled A RAP CRITIC? Oh, well, I'm so glad you asked, my friend, because the answer is very simple. If you were my age or slightly older, and damn sure if you're younger, then the chances are pretty high that your opinions and views on things in hip hop have probably been shaped or influenced in some form or fashion by personalities and writers representing the culture. And we know the truth is, a lot of times, those people are actually kind of not immersed in the culture, more so on the outskirts or the sidelines, reporting on the culture. Because why? It's their job. And if it's your job as a writer or personality, we know that they tend to use sensationalized or dramatized wording. And that could do its own sort of damage, especially if you grew up in the eras where the sources and the resources and the outlets were limited and funneled through this narrow space, right? So basically, if a radio host says this East versus West is out of hand, you chew that up, you believe that, because who's going to tell you differently? What else are you seeing? That's what you grow up believing. When we know now that that was completely a media construct. You know, 5 mics and XXLs used to matter a lot when they were the only 2 giants in the game. The game has changed. And it's time for us to have a different paradigm and different way that we go about looking at what makes something great, what makes something the best. You know, what system are we using? And I think the best judges of that, yeah, the experts are nice. You know, you could call me an expert. You look me up, Google me, Malik 16, right? But it sounds better when it comes from collective voices. And so what I want to do is create a global hip hop community. Now, what is a global hip hop community? And think about it. We're on YouTube right now. YouTube is a worldwide platform. What better way to pull the opinions and ideas of people all across the planet who can all agree on this one thing that we love and live, which is hip hop, in a centralized space? That's what this channel represents, a centralized space where the global hip hop community can chime in and determine for themselves if these things we've been told are classics. And with that, I wanted to create a metric standard to measure that by. What makes a classic a classic? Let's get into the analysis, the objective analysis of what makes a classic, not just because we drank the Kool-Aid of what we've been told forever. You know, a lot of things we haven't questioned in hip hop. Let's question a little, not too much, but a little. And yes, it's music. So at the end of the day, music is a subjective art form. Art itself is subjective. So there's always going to boil down to opinion. But my goal here is hopefully to have you start looking at this channel as the ESPN of hip hop and try to create a space where we have the most objective approach to ranking and determining what makes a good album. So with that, this is a channel where we're going to revisit classic hip hop albums. And by classic, I mean 5 years or older. We really don't want to go any younger than 5 years just because you need time to let albums breathe. When the hype dies down and everything surrounding it dies down, you listen and revisit it. And that doesn't mean there's no such thing as instant vintage. For instance, when I heard Victory Lap by Nipsey, the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, this is a classic. But just to be on the safe side, 5 years or older. So this is not the channel where we're going to be doing contemporary album reviews, the newest releases, no hip hop gossip. There's plenty of other spaces on YouTube for that. There's also plenty of YouTube music critics on there. This is not Malik 16's music critique channel. This is the channel where we are creating a standard space and a global hip hop community where you guys chime in, and I'm just the voice guiding it because of my experience in the field as a hip hop curator, hip hop historian, and former recording artist. Sometimes I might jump back in the booth. But yeah, with that said, since we're launching this off, this is video 1, and I want to explain the scale and the ranking system. And I think we need a ranking system because unfortunately, in my experience, out of all genres of music, hip hop just seems to be the one that is most often almost ruined by the hypersensitivity attached to it. This is the one style of music where, as much as I love a good barbershop debate, I can't think of any other music where, you know, the moment you say you don't like a project, you're called a hater. Or, you know, you will lose friendships and relationships over, you know, which rappers you side with. Or people really get on comments and start, you know, making threats and throwing up gang signs over how you talked about a rapper. You can't say anything about a rapper's product after they die. You know, you can't say that you're better than another rapper without getting jumped in the club or getting your arm broken. It's happened, right? So it's just like, we can do better than that. When do we create boundaries and limits where we can have an adult, mature conversation about the quality of a product? Because it's still a product for the consumer masses. And so that's why the metric exists. With no further ado, I'm going to explain it. And on this channel, we are breaking albums down into two categories. The first category is the album itself, so the product. And the second category is the rapper's performance on that album. So not really here to talk about the rapper's career, their personal life, their image so much. Again, there's other channels for that. We are specifically, strictly talking about the rapper's performance on the album that we are reviewing. So those are our only two categories. Within those two categories, though, there are 10 dimensions. 10 dimensions for each category. And within those, we're going to be ranking each dimension on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. So we call this scale the I Used to Love Her scale. Shout out to the homie Swan, my LA homie Swan. She came up with that title loosely. I christened the scale with that name because we are using 5 heartbeats.
Check it out. Dang.
On a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats in each dimension, that's how you're going to determine each of those dimensions in the categories. So I know it's going to get a little confusing. I'm going to go slowly and break it down. It's going to feel like a high school math class, but it's all good because we're creating something new. All right, so category 1, the album itself, right? The first dimension that you want to consider on the album is the quality of the production. That means it's not about how you felt the first time you heard the beat. We're not here for the nostalgia play so much. Don't let your feelings get in the way of the analytics. This is about the actual dopeness of the beats on the album. Were they good? Do you hear them now and you cringe because they're dated? Does it sound like someone's first Casio keyboard beat, or do they stand the test of time? Do they still resonate? Do they still have a vibe to them? And is that throughout the album? Not like 2 or 3 tracks. Does the whole album knock? Does it still have that feeling with it? Because it has the feeling, not because of your memories. All right, so that's dimension 1. And that's something you want to consider and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. This takes us to dimension 2, which is the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. It's one thing to have dope beats. The cohesiveness of the sonic bed is where you want to consider, how do they sound together? Do they blend? Do they flow into each other? Do the beats themselves tell a story? Does the music itself tell a story before the words even pop over it, right? If you heard the instrumental of this album, where would you rank it? All right, so that's what you want to consider, you know, to pull out an SAT word, that it doesn't create a cacophony of sounds that are clashing with each other. Like, oh, this beat, this song came on and it ripped you right out of the mode that you were in the other. So that's dimension 2, and you want to rank that on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, the cohesiveness of that production. All right, which takes us to dimension 3. And that is the question of, does this album have an intentional mood or tone? A lot of times this may happen accidentally. Maybe it just all sounds like a certain mode, or it takes you to a zone because, you know, that's just how it came together. But for the most part, you know, most good rappers, most good artists, because not all artists are rappers, not all rappers are artists, know that they want to take you somewhere, and they put that into the song construction and the beats they choose. So that's a question you want to ask, especially if there's a theme to the album. If there's a theme to the album should have a mood and a tone. If it's dark, if it's upbeat, if it's party, 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 If it's a love album, we get all, if it's a trap album, you know, all these things matter. Intentional, mood, or tone. You want to rank that on a scale from 1 to 5, because the question is, was it intentional? And if it was, how well did they execute it? All right. That takes us to dimension 4. That is the repetition, the repetitiveness of both sounds and words on this album. So we got the quality of production and the cohesiveness. Let's say the beats are dope, they all flow together. How often do the beats sound the same? Granted, if it's one producer who helms the whole album, it's expected that you're gonna get some of the same sounds being used. You know, every producer has their signature go-tos, but most seasoned listeners can pick up on if it's laziness by the producer. It's like, oh man, track 7 sounds just like track 2. It could have been the same song. You never want that feeling that it could have been, or, you know, you get lost in it, like, didn't I just hear this song? Same thing with the words of the rapper, right? It's one thing if a rapper is intentionally trying to rep and shout out and brand something. You know, you hear something by Mike Jones. I know Mike Jones, right?
I'm Mike Jones, don't act like you don't know the name.
If you're saying his number multiple times, you understand that's on purpose. He's trying to brand and drill that point in your head. But if it's a rapper you hear, they use the same word a lot. It's like, oh, this must be their favorite word because they use this word like 4 times on the album. Or they just get lazy and are saying the same line a couple different ways. That's different from if you hear them shouting out their block or their crew or their gang. That's different. That's branding, that's repping, as opposed to when you can tell rappers being lazy because they just couldn't think of enough things to hold a verse down, right? So you want to think about the repetition. That goes for the sounds of the hooks too. Did this hook sound like the hook from another song? Did they just get lazy on the beats and the words? So something to consider and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That's dimension 4. Takes us to dimension 5. The content on the album compared to the amount of songs. So the content versus the amount of songs. This is a big point in hip hop because whether you're making a 20-song album or a 7-song album, which is a more recent trend, the idea is, what are you giving the people? Is it all the same talk? Is it the same blah, blah? For 20 songs, that's a lot. That's a lot. How much are you talking about? How diverse is your material? What do you have to say for this many songs? Are you wasting people's times? So, you know, my favorite trope in hip hop is the rapper that gives you, you know, 10 songs, maybe 12 songs are like murder, murder, kill, kill, blam, blam. And then the last song, they got the choir on there. They're like asking why their cousin had to get shot. They asking God if there's a heaven for Jesus. Like, bruh, you really think karma don't exist? So just funny little tropes that happen in hip hop, cliches, and something you want to consider. If you invested in this product, you know, how much is the rapper saying with the time allotted? And you want to rank that on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, which takes us to dimension 6. Features. Why are features important? Well, features can add to an album or they can take away. You think about a feature like AZ's iconic performance and appearance on Nas's first album. That actually started his career, you know? But we also know there have been albums that sound like compilations because they have so many features. So features can dilute an album too. We also had the famous phenomenon of a feature upstaging the rapper. People, you know, I don't know who started that, but once people started viewing those things as, oh, he got killed on his own song, that's a hard thing to take out the culture now. So you really, really want to consider what the features did to this album and rank that on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That's dimension 6. Takes us to dimension 7. The question of, do the weakest songs on this album take away from the album? Good question, right? Some of us, most of us will have songs that we prefer over the others, but it's a difference between skipping through tracks and just having favorites. You know, do you have to go past a certain amount of songs to get to the songs you like on an album? That's a question you want to ask yourself. And how bad does the worst song weigh this album down? Are you saying, man, this album would be a classic if you take this song out? It's not a good thing, especially if it's more than one. So you want to consider how bad the weakest song is and how much it stops the flow of the album. You know, a lot of times we compare rappers to their own work, right? You'll say, you know, Nas will never make another Illmatic, so you're always comparing, but you want to be fair to the project that you're talking about in that moment. So something to consider and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 8, everybody's favorite, mass appeal. How wide was this album going to get? This is more of a seasoned listener question, but I feel like for the most part, we can usually tell when a rapper knew that this album was going to go far, or if it just accidentally blew up over time. Maybe it got rediscovered later on down the line. Maybe it was a critical darling, but not a commercial hit. But regardless of what your favorite rapper tells you, anybody who makes the decision to be a major recording artist, their goal is to get heard by as many ears as possible. They may tell you they want to keep it real and keep it street and they didn't care about the fame. You may not want the fame, but you want as wide of an audience as possible to keep those ticket sales going, to keep them shows full, and to keep money in your pocket. And to be heard, have what you have to say be known and recognized. And don't let anyone tell you different. Otherwise, you just make little secret mixtapes for your homies in the basement. Stop it. And so with that, some have mastered this skill of knowing how. Jay-Z is a master of knowing how to get to a wider audience. When 50 first came out, you know, he was a master at that, as opposed to people who stay in their little bubble. And so that's one thing you want to consider, you know, how far-reaching was this album going to be based on what was on there, based on the producers they chose, the way the beats were, the hooks they put together, the features they had. Were they just riding a wave? Was it too trendy? Was it too try hard? You know, when you try hard, you die hard. That's what they say. No yay. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That's dimension 8. Takes us to dimension 9. My favorite dimension is what we call the 3 I's. That is impact, innovation, and influence. And with those 3 I's, what you want to be taking into account is what waves did this album make when it first came out? Did it blow sales out the water? I know a lot of people feel like you shouldn't have to consider sales and albums, but think about how it hit when it hit. Was it a storm? You know, was it a media blitz? Was it a big deal? Was it a slow burn? You know, which takes us to innovation. Did it change anything for the game when it came out? Was the packaging different? You know, the colors used, the way the material used, the photograph, the imagery on the album cover. Did they create a new style of sampling? Did a new whole subgenre come from the innovation on this album? The producers they chose? Did they launch multiple careers? Did they create a new style of rap? And then that takes us to the 3rd I, which is influence. What came after this? You know, did they introduce a new dance? Did they introduce a new fashion, a new slang? Maybe something negative? Did drug culture rise more from this album being put out? And that's debatable, right? But still, those things happen. Did rappers start doing things after this rapper on this album made it okay to do it? Something to really consider and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That's the 3 I's: impact, innovation, and influence. And that takes us to the final dimension, 10, which is the overall creativity and timelessness of the album, right? Again, this is where you separate your feelings and memories from the actual feel of the album. Did this album stand the test of time? When you put it in, does it still stand out as a unique body of work? Or does it sound like everything else that came out at its time? Can you pop it in today and still get a feeling from it? And how creative was it? How far did they go? Was it abstract? Did they veer into the abstract? Did they put a lot of effort into it? All things you want to consider and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And those are your 10 dimensions in our first category, which is the album itself. So to review, dimension 1 is the quality of production. Dimension 2 is the cohesiveness of that production. Dimension 3 is the intentional mood or tone. Dimension 4 is the repetitiveness factor. Dimension 5 is the amount of content versus the amount of songs. Dimension 6 is the features. Dimension 7 is the question of whether the weakest songs take away from the album. 8 is mass appeal, 9 are the 3 I's, impact, innovation, and influence, and 10 is the timelessness and creativity. Stay tuned. We're gonna go to our second video where I break down our second category, which is the rapper's performance on that album. Make sure you like and subscribe as we launch this new venture. In the meantime, A RAP CRITIC. Talk about it while I live it.